Well, welcome to this session on diversity data. We've heard a lot about diversity data through the session so far today. So we'd like to explore this topic in a bit more detail. Before I introduce the panel, I'd like to just give a little bit of context to this conversation. It's been quite clear from the previous sessions that the lack of diversity data is a big issue for the industry, and I myself find it very odd that in an industry which is so focused on data, it doesn't have very good data about its key asset, its people. And in a study that was done as part of the Holding Up the Mirror report that was produced earlier this year by LGBT Great and EY and co-sponsored by the Diversity Project in North America and the UK, they found that 80% of the HR leaders in this industry thought that diversity data was a priority, but only 20% thought they were any good at it. So there's clearly a big gap here. And we explored some of those challenges earlier in the earlier sessions. And in the same time, we know that the consultants, the asset owners, the regulators and the government are putting more scrutiny on the industry and other industries around their diversity data and inclusive practices. Some firms are doing a really good job in this area, but others, I think, have really got to raise their game. And there are some useful resources out there to help. So in the last year, there are 2 reports that have come out. One by the IA, which is a really useful sort of background guide to why diversity data is important and how you might go about it. And the Holding Up the Mirror report that's been mentioned a couple of times today already goes into current practice in a lot more detail, but also usefully has some great case studies written up in it that I think will shed light on what is possible. If you haven't read those publications, I'd really recommend that you do that. So now I'd like to introduce the panel today. I'm joined by Helen Price, who's Head of Stewardship at Brunel Pension Partnership, and who is the co-lead of the Asset Owner Diversity Charter, by Mitesh Sheth, who's CEO of Reddington, and he brought together a group of consultants to focus on how we maybe coordinate our activities or the consultants' activities around collecting data so that we weren't all asking different questions of the asset managers. And then finally by Tosin James Odukoya, who is Head of Inclusion, Diversity and Talent at Quilter, and who can shed lights on how it is possible to collect data, but how some of the challenges can be overcome. So maybe start with you, Tosin. Why is it important to collect diversity data?
I mean, first of all, I think it stops assumptions. Not all white people attended private school and not all black people come from a lower socioeconomic background. When we started collating data at Quilter, what we found is that people didn't actually trust what was being done with the data. And I think it's incredibly important that we're transparent. So it's important that you collate the data, but again, it's what you're doing with it. So talent attraction, you measure that. Entry into your companies, you measure that. And then you look at it from various aspects. So is it from gender? Are we attracting women and men? Or are we also attracting non-binary people? It's got to a stage where people don't have the data and are not seeing what's been done with it. And I think that's how you start. It's incredibly important to be able to look at promotions. And again, what's our starting point? People do not know the data, do not know what the representation is. And I think it's incredibly important to start from there. So what we're doing at Quilter is we're reporting on that data and we're starting from leadership and we're ensuring that people actually know our starting point, and then you start to talk about targets. I think if you initially just start to talk about targets before actually saying this is our current representation, it doesn't make sense and people don't actually connect with that message.
Thank you. And Quilter have been very successful over the last 12 months in improving the sort of disclosure rates around ethnicity data. I mean, could you talk a little bit more about how you've achieved that?
I think last year was a wake-up call for the majority. And we have a CEO, Paul Feeney, who is incredibly inspiring. He created what we call the Inclusion and Diversity Steering Committee, chairs that meeting, has never missed a meeting. We've got engagement at board level, and when I say engagement, I mean we have meetings and we talk about what we're doing and what we plan to do. We talk about engagement from the perspective of them also providing their data and being transparent with it, but it goes back to the message. Who is delivering that message? If it's just me, most people just see me as someone that's a token because I'm a black woman. And that's something that we need to avoid. What Paul has done really well is informed people of what it means to him and what it means to our organisation. And we have, in our Inclusion and Diversity Steering Committee, we also have the CEO for our high net worth segment. We have Karen Cook, who is our COO. We have business sponsors who chair and sponsor our various diversity networks. We have the HRD, and we obviously have myself. And that's incredibly important for people to feel like they are being represented, but also that leadership care. So we're taking it a step further now, and we're actually being a lot more transparent with that data. We're using Workday. So the data we collate is aligned to our individual records. But what I'm working on is blocking people from seeing that information. So sexual orientation and disability are two areas that people are very uncomfortable with sharing, whilst with ethnicity, it shot up to 85%, and that was last year. So we set targets, and we want 80 to 90% completion across various diversity data points, including socioeconomic background, as we've heard earlier today. And what I'm ensuring is that people go as far as knowing the names of people that will be able to have access to that information. That's what you call transparency, and that's how we're building trust. And then we will present that data, and each quarter work with various ExCo members to ensure that there is change over time.
Brilliant, thank you. And Helen, I'm going to hand you the clicker.
Thank you.
But you've been doing a huge amount of work over the last 12 months on the Asset Owner Diversity Charter. Could you maybe talk a little bit about what you've been doing?
Sure, thank you. So the Charter was developed by a group of UK asset owners who came together last year really to review how we were holding our asset managers to account on diversity and inclusion, and also in part from the activities we've seen in society, and the information is available that shows that the investment industry is still lagging behind other industries. So we brought the working group together to sort of discuss this, and really had sort of three key areas that we wanted to see improvement on with the project. And that was getting more asset owners involved in discussing diversity and inclusivity with their asset managers, greater transparency and standardisation of data so that we can have better informed, engaged conversations, and ultimately an improvement in the diversity and inclusion within the industry. So out of that project, what we did is we launched the Asset Owner Diversity Charter, and that was launched in August with 17 signatories representing over £1 trillion in assets under advice or consultancy. And the signatories to the Charter committed to three key areas. So the first was including diversity and inclusion within manager selection. What that means is that signatories commit to ensuring that it forms part of the scored criteria. It's not a separate add-on question that's not looked at. And ensuring that data disclosure is part of the investment management agreement. The second element was ongoing manager monitoring, so continued long-term engagement with managers on how they're looking to improve this. And a key commitment of this was that all signatories commit to use the Charter questionnaire on an annual basis with their managers in its entirety. And then the last commitment is just more leadership and collaboration. So engaging with one another, sharing best practice, and a continued commitment to work together to seek improvement. So the launch was great and fantastic, and it's great to see, and we had some involvement with consultants. So we've got 4 consultants signed up to the charter, an additional 5 that committed to using the questionnaire. And the questionnaire is a key part of the charter for us, seeing that data transparency leading into the engagement. And it's both qualitative and quantitative. We road tested it in January to seek feedback. We know that it's not 100% perfect. It's a work in progress that we'll look to seek feedback on from across the industry and improve year on year. But we really sort of focus on some key areas. And what we found is that a lot of asset managers are disclosing what's happening at the board level. Here's our policy. Here's our paragraph that the marketing team have whipped up. Does that answer your question? And it doesn't give us enough information to see how you're really, truly embedded in the organisation. And we think it's every employee's responsibility to incorporate diversity and inclusion and make sure that you're fostering a culture where all employees feel welcome. So we split this across sections, and I'll give a couple of examples of some questions that are asked. We went through, as I mentioned, with the consultancy group, shared the questionnaire, and together agreed on this core set of questions. And we really went through question by question. Why are we asking for this information? What do we want to know and why? So one of the areas we ask about is within your employee policies. So do you, when you're surveying your employees, look at the responses across sectionality of data? So are your black employees, are your policies working for your black employees? Are your policies working for your employees that have a disability? If you're not looking at your response from that, how do you know that your policies are serving all of your employees and not just the core set? And then how do you identify that they're not feeling included if you're not listening to their opinion? One of the other areas that we look at is around recruitment. So this is a big barrier that we hear constantly from asset managers. We've put job adverts out, but nobody's applying. And frankly, what asset owners want to know now is, I want you to move from identifying the barriers to telling me how you're breaking them down. So I want to go into more detail on how you're challenging your recruitment companies, whether you're using quotas for your interviewing panel, how you're looking at the CVs that are coming through, and really thinking about that process and getting more people coming through. So we look at this all the way through in the questionnaire. So it's been great since launching. We're, as I mentioned, multi-year project. So the next steps of the project are the questionnaire is now launched on 3 platform providers: Camera Data, Diligence Vault, and Invest RFP. That's already been rolled out on those platforms, so some of you may have received it through that avenue. The response date for that is the 31st of March next year, and the signatories to the charter, most of them will be looking to align to that date. So you'll be seeing requests coming out from the signatories in the next few weeks, but most in Q1 next year. We're continuing to seek signatories. We've added 2 in the last couple of weeks, which is great to see. And we are also speaking with multi-managers about potential interest in use in that, and looking to bring together more parties in the industry, such as eVestment, ILPA, PRI, and other different networks to see how we can further standardise and drive data transparency.
Yeah, it's a brilliant initiative. I mean, really sort of well done. Thank you. Mitesh, could you perhaps talk a little bit about from the consultant's perspective, because you took it upon yourself to try and bring the consultants together on this topic, because perhaps you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jane. And yes, Helen, for the phenomenal job that you've done in kicking it off. I think we were just really conscious that this is so important, yet the more and more fund managers that we talk to, even as we looked at it as our own organisations, we recognise just how hard it is to get this data and get people to complete it and trust it, but also to know what are the right questions to ask with all the fears about what will be done with it, how will we be judged for this, and so on. I think my fear was that if you add to that the challenge that every asset owner and every consultant will ask you different questions and will frame them in a different way, and will define things in different ways, our fear was that it would just create an impossible task in being able to actually make progress. And it was actually at one of the diversity project meetings where Stuart White had challenged me to say, well, if only you consultants could get your heads together and get some consistency around this. And I said, well, that's a great idea. I'll do exactly that. So I did email the leaders of all the other consultancy firms, the UK and global ones, and say, I'd really like us to get our heads together, and are you willing to share how you're researching fund managers from a DE&I perspective? What are the questions you're asking, and what are you going to do with those? And I was completely blown away by the response. The consultancy community are not known for sharing much, certainly not with each other, and very little with fund managers really as a starting point. So I was really blown away, and it's a really exciting time of change for me to see how willing the consultancies firms were to come together, first of all, and how openly they were willing to share with their leads on what are they asking, how are they using that information. And over the course of just 3 months and over 9 meetings, we all kind of shared our questions, the ones that already existed and new ones, and then we interrogated each of them, as you said, around what are we really trying to get to, and are these inputs or outputs, and what does a good answer really even look like, and how many years might it take for someone to be able to demonstrate this. And what was really we were really conscious of the fact that this was going to be a multi-year, if not a multi-decade process, over which clearly these questions could evolve. The goal was consistency, and our hope was, with consistency, a single agreed set of questions, definitions, and ways of monitoring it that we could get real momentum and could support all of you in being able to get the support, the resources, and the backing within your firms to actually get this done.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So we've had a couple of questions in from the audience. There's one around diversity data, particularly ethnicity data, being challenging for boutique firms where they've not got many employees, because it becomes much more obvious who's answered what question. So if you've got any, maybe Tosin, you could give some advice to how do small companies go about this?
I mean, again, I think it's important to hear for what it means to leadership. I have this challenge, and I know a number of black colleagues have this challenge too, where people expect you to be the person that speaks on diversity all the time. And I think when someone from, in a leadership or management position says, I also come from a lower socioeconomic background, I also haven't been to university, or again, we heard it earlier, storytelling, telling their story. It makes people feel very warm. It gets people very comfortable. When you have sessions on topics like menopause or very sensitive topics like colorism, so move away from racism and actually talk about colorism, which a number of people from various countries connect with, that makes people also then have their own input and say, you know what, I can't connect with that, but because I have a northern accent, I also have experienced discrimination. And I think that's what smaller companies need to do. I've worked for a company with 1,000 people globally, and now Quilter, that's almost 4,000 people. And really it's the same thing, but for smaller companies, I think it's more transparency and people having better conversations.
So not relying necessarily on the data, but on the conversations. And I do know that there are some firms out there that use, rather than using their HR system to collect data, if it's only small numbers, maybe getting a third party to do the analysis can at least get the step in the right direction. Absolutely. Yeah. There's the question in here about focusing on diversity data. How do you prevent a tick box mentality to improving diversity numbers? I mean, Helen, maybe it's a question for you. Is how are you going to interpret this information to check, to see whether it's real or whether firms are just kind of going through the motions?
Just before I answer that question, I just wanted to add something on to the last one. From the perspective of the Diversity Charter questionnaire, we absolutely do not want managers disclosing any information to us that breaches GDPR rules or could be reverse engineered. So there is the option on there that you can indicate that it would be in breach of that or your internal policies. But the fact that you can indicate that to me signals to me that you're aware of that, and so you know who your employees are. So to your question, in terms of tick box approach, that's why we felt it was very important as part of the questionnaire to have both the qualitative and the quantitative. So the questions focus on what have your activities been over the previous 12 months. So you can tell me, not the story, I don't want sort of marketing spill, but you can tell me what the actual actions are that you've undertaken to seek progress and make progress in your firm internally.
Mitesh, any other thoughts on the avoiding tick box approach?
Yeah, I think it's, I hope it is. I think it's pretty hard to game from the way we've tried to design it. I think it really is going to challenge everybody who completes it, including ourselves, to have to really think about what exactly are we doing to be able to move this agenda forward within our firms. How effective has it been? Who specifically has benefited from it? And what progress are we making year on year? That's the goal of it. This isn't about benchmarking. It's not about comparing one firm to another. It's about seeing what your ambition is, what your strategy and policy are, and how you're progressing against those from one year to the next. I think that's quite hard to game, especially if you take a multi-year view to it.
Yeah. Tosin, a question for you, which is how did your firm engage people managers in the process of building trust for data collection? We've talked about the leaders, but...
Yes, I've actually shared with Mitesh and Helen that I've attended so many town halls that I need another week's break. It's quite interesting to see what is working. What we're doing is we're approaching people as groups and not necessarily saying it's just up to line managers to encourage this. I think what I'm seeing, which isn't actually working, is placing ownership on just managers and our leaders. It's for everyone. Everyone's got to be engaged in this. So I don't have a target group, and I'm not targeting just managers. I'm actually just appealing to everyone. But the power of the diversity networks that we actually call communities are that they do a lot of that work, and a number of them are people managers. And we have an employee forum. So we're using other platforms and not just engaging people managers.
So it's about finding your advocates and working with them.
But ensuring that people are aware that it's a responsibility for all of us, and not just for managers to engage in that. Talking about trust goes back to the point of what we're doing in the system, which is your managers won't have access to that data. We're not interested in your personal information. We're interested in looking at us as a collective.
Yeah, it's the aggregate data
Absolutely.
and the messages coming out of that matters. I'm not sure how much longer we've got, but we've one question here about the role of the regulator in pushing for more data collection. Is anyone willing to comment on the role of the regulator?
Well, we've obviously seen the discussion paper that was issued seeking feedback with a commitment from the regulator that they're going to issue a consultation on that in January. So, I think the regulators probably do have a role to play, but we need to ensure that we don't see, again, duplication. We want to see standardisation. So working with what's already out there and good practice and really bringing that into the approach. My hope is that if the regulators are showing interest and the asset owners are showing interest and the consultants are showing interest and your employees and potential employees are showing interest, that that will motivate that further action needs to be taken.
Brilliant. Are there any questions from the audience in the room? Oh, it says here we've run out of time, so I'm between you and your drinks and your canapes. So I'd like to thank the panel for their wonderful contribution this afternoon. Maybe you could all join me in a round of thanks to them. And please join us out in the ante room for drinks and canapes. Apparently networking, but hopefully it'll be fun. Thank you very much.